They mocked the black waitress at a wedding until the white groom left with her. The ballroom glowed with a golden light that spilled from chandeliers heavy with crystal. Every surface shone. Silver cutlery lined the tables like small mirrors. Ivory linens fell in perfect folds, and roses filled the air with a faint sweetness. A string quartet played from a corner, their bows moving in rhythm. The music almost drowned by the laughter and chatter of guests in silk gowns and black suits. Among them moved a woman in a plain uniform, her shoes scuffed, her hair tied back neatly. She carried herself with precision, each step balanced, each gesture controlled, trays steady in her hands no matter how heavy the crystal glasses. She was the kind of figure most people never truly saw, though she walked in plain sight. She was a worker, one of many, yet unlike the others, her posture never bent. Even when someone snapped fingers at her or waved her down impatiently, she nodded calmly, met the demand with quiet efficiency, and moved on. The night belonged to others. All eyes followed the bride in her lace gown, the groom in his pressed tuxedo, the circle of bridesmaids glittering with jewelry, and the groomsmen laughing loudly over drinks. The music rose and fell. The waiters wove between tables like shadows, and the guests spoke only of themselves. Yet here and there, unnoticed, the black waitress allowed herself small glances around the hall. She saw the towering cake layered with sugar flowers, the polished marble floor reflecting soft light, and the elaborate decorations that must have taken weeks to plan. She noticed how carefully the wineglasses were arranged, how many dishes the chefs had prepared, how much had been spent to make the evening perfect. Still, she knew perfection was only for those at the tables, never for the ones who served them. A man in a dark suit brushed past her, nearly knocking the tray from her hands, but she steadied it with barely a motion. A group of women laughed at something not meant for her ears, yet their eyes flickered toward her and lingered before sliding away. She kept her face composed, her back straight, and continued. Years of work had taught her that silence was stronger than any protest, and composure was armor against the sharp edge of ridicule. She was unseen, and she was expected to remain unseen. Still, there was a grace to the way she moved through the glittering crowd, a quiet dignity that did not need to be noticed to exist. At times, her gaze would fall on small details that others ignored. A child dropped a fork under a table, and she bent with a smile to pick it up, placing it back before the parents even turned their heads. A glass threatened to tip at the edge of a cloth, and her steady hand caught it before it spilled. No one applauded, no one thanked her, yet the evening continued smoothly because of her unseen labor. It was her rhythm, her silent steps between laughter and music, that held the evening together. And though the grand hall was filled with voices, her silence carried a strength that would not go unnoticed for long. Laughter rose first in whispers, sharp and pointed, darting through the air like needles. The bridesmaids had gathered near the edge of the hall, their satin dresses catching the light, their smiles curling into something cruel. One of them tilted her head toward the waitress and nudged the other, her eyes fixed on the scuffed black shoes that peeked beneath the plain uniform. The joke did not need to be spoken for the others to understand, but still it was voiced deliberately loud. Just look at her. Look at those shoes. As though the words themselves were another stain on the floor for the waitress to clean. A ripple of laughter spread across their circle, a laugh that drew the attention of the groomsmen nearby. Soon it became a game, each comment sharper than the last, all made just loud enough to drift across the tables and into the ears of anyone who cared to listen. She is just the help. That was the phrase they liked best, the phrase that carried in the air even as the music played on. Just the help. As if those words stripped her of her humanity, reducing her to nothing more than a uniform and a pair of tired hands. Their voices rose with a confidence that came not from wit but from cruelty, the kind of cruelty that grows when it knows it will not be punished. They smirked, they whispered, then they spoke openly, laughing louder with every exchange. Some of the guests nearby chuckled nervously, unsure whether to join in or to pretend they had not heard. Others shifted in their seats, eyes fixed on their plates, pretending to be occupied, unwilling to be drawn into the mockery, yet unwilling to speak against it either. The waitress heard every word. She felt the laughter press against her like a cold wind, but she did not flinch. She kept moving, tray balanced with perfect composure, steps measured with the same dignity she had carried from the beginning of the night. Her silence was not weakness but strength, though the crowd around her did not see it that way. To them, her calm was only another reason to sneer, another excuse to make her into a spectacle for their own amusement. A bridesmaid leaned close to her companion, covering her mouth as she laughed, yet her words rang clear in the air. She does not belong here. She is ruining the picture. The others nodded, sipping their wine, their eyes flicking toward her with disdain. Every step she took became heavier, not from the glasses on her tray, but from the weight of so many eyes pressing down on her. The hall that had once glittered with light now seemed colder, the crystal above her head mocking her with every sparkle. Still, she did not stumble. She did not falter. Her silence was a shield, and though the barbs of cruelty struck hard, they did not pierce through. In that sea of laughter and sneers, she stood as a quiet figure of grace, unseen by most, ridiculed by some, yet unbroken. The cruelty grew louder, but beneath it all, there remained a strength in her step, a promise that the night would not end as the guests imagined. Dinner was announced, and the hall shifted from chatter to the clinking of cutlery and the steady movement of servers carrying platters through the maze of tables. The string quartet softened their tune, letting the sound of plates and voices fill the air. The waitress moved with practiced calm, her tray balanced with bowls of steaming soup. She wove between chairs, setting dishes gently before guests who barely lifted their eyes to acknowledge her. Yet even in the rhythm of service, the sharp whispers of cruelty did not fade. They grew louder, emboldened by wine and the company of others who found the mockery entertaining. The bridesmaids leaned together, heads nearly touching, their lips curved into sly smiles. Their laughter carried across the table, no longer hidden behind hands. They spoke about her shoes again, how dull they looked against the polished marble, how her plain uniform ruined the beauty of the evening. The groomsmen joined, pointing openly, their voices heavy with condescension. They called her invisible, yet insisted on drawing every eye toward her, making her presence a spectacle. The guests at nearby tables shifted uneasily, but few dared to speak. Some chose instead to laugh along, letting the cruelty spread like a stain across the celebration. Then came the bride. Draped in silk and lace, jewels glittering at her throat, she basked in the adoration of her friends and the attention of the hall. But her eyes, cold and sharp, landed on the waitress as she bent low to pour a glass of wine. The bride smirked, her words meant to be heard by more than just her circle. She does not belong here. Not at my perfect day. The line cut through the hall, heavier than any whisper. A silence followed for only a heartbeat before laughter erupted, loud and merciless. It echoed against the high ceilings, drowning the music, filling every corner of the ballroom. The waitress swallowed hard. Her face remained calm, her back straight as she set down the final plate and stepped back. She could feel the laughter pressing in on her from all sides, as though the walls themselves mocked her. Yet she did not falter. Her silence was steady, her composure unshaken. She did not meet their eyes, but neither did she cower. She moved on to the next table, steady as ever, her tray never trembling, her steps never broken. Every guest who watched saw her quiet grace, though many pretended not to notice, unwilling to break the tide of cruelty. The hall sparkled with wealth and beauty, but in that moment, it seemed poisoned. Laughter rolled on, sharp as glass. Some found it amusing, others uncomfortable, but no one dared to stop it. Through it all, the waitress endured. Her silence was not the silence of defeat, but of strength, a shield against humiliation. She held her head high, and though the cruelty echoed louder than the music, her calm presence was a quiet defiance, unseen by those who mocked, but undeniable to those who truly watched. The groom sat beside his bride, his hand resting stiffly on the table as though it had been carved from stone. His smile, so carefully placed for the photographers and the watching guests, faltered with every cruel word he heard. At first, he had tried to ignore it, to let the chatter blend with the music, but the voices of the bridesmaids and groomsmen carried too clearly, too sharp to dismiss. Each laugh landed like a weight, and his eyes followed the waitress as she moved through the hall, carrying trays with a composure none of the guests could match. The ridicule was relentless, but she did not falter. She bent to place plates, poured wine with steady hands, and walked on as though she could not hear. Yet he knew she did. He saw the flicker in her eyes, the tightening of her jaw, the faint stillness in her breath. She was swallowing the pain, layer by layer, covering it with dignity that no one in that mocking circle seemed able to recognize. Earlier that evening, he had noticed her in quieter moments, when no one else cared to look. He had watched as she crouched beside a child who had dropped a spoon and whispered something that made the child giggle before handing the silver back. He had seen her brush past a guest with an accidental spill of champagne and respond not with irritation but with a soft reassurance, steadying the glass before it tipped further. There had been warmth in her manner, a patience that felt rare in a room brimming with vanity. Now, that same warmth was met with cruelty, and the groom felt something in his chest twist. He turned to his bride, radiant in lace and jewels, her face glowing beneath the soft chandelier light. She laughed with the others, her words sharper than theirs, her voice ringing with confidence that came from knowing no one would challenge her. His stomach tightened. The woman he had promised his life to reveled in mocking someone who had done nothing but serve with grace. He tried to force his smile again, but it felt brittle, breaking the longer he sat there. Every glance toward the waitress drew him further from the circle at the table and closer to a truth he could not ignore. The music played on, but his ears caught only the cruelty. He could not stop watching the waitress. There was no protest on her lips, no plea for kindness. Her silence was a shield, and in that silence he saw strength greater than the noise of the entire hall. She was not invisible, not to him. She was the only one in the room who carried herself with the dignity he had been taught to admire, the dignity he had long searched for in others but rarely found. He looked back at his bride, then at the bridesmaids who smirked and sneered, and the contrast was unbearable. A tension rose in him, a pull between the life laid out before him and the truth revealed in the quiet grace of a woman no one else saw. The laughter around him blurred into a distant echo. His heart pounded with the knowledge that something inside him had shifted, and nothing about the night would remain the same. The bride's laughter rang out like a bell, sharp and bright, demanding every ear in the ballroom. She leaned back in her chair, her veil shimmering in the light, and her hands swept out in a gesture meant to gather the attention of her bridesmaids. The chatter softened as her voice cut through the music. She pointed to the floor, where a thin stream of wine had spilled, crimson against the white cloth and polished marble. Her lips curled into a cruel smile as she called the waitress forward, her words loud enough for every guest to hear. "Clean it. Kneel here, now, in front of all of us." For a moment, the room hesitated, a ripple of silence passing through the tables, broken only by the clink of cutlery. Then came the gasps, followed quickly by laughter. The bridesmaids leaned close to one another, grinning, their eyes glittering with the thrill of humiliation served fresh before them. The groomsmen shifted in their seats, some laughing openly, others hiding their amusement behind their glasses. The bride glowed in her cruelty, certain that her power over the moment was absolute. The waitress stepped forward, her face calm, her eyes lowered, her tray placed neatly aside. She did not argue, did not protest. Her knees bent, and she lowered herself onto the marble floor, her movements quiet and controlled as though she were carrying out the most ordinary of duties. Her hands reached for the cloth, folding it carefully, her fingers steady even as laughter echoed around her. The humiliation pressed down like a weight, but she wore dignity like a second skin. Even kneeling, she did not appear broken. Her back was straight, her head bowed only for the task, not in surrender. Around the room, the reaction split. Some guests stared with wide eyes, whispering to each other behind their hands, unsettled by the cruelty of the command. Others laughed with the bride, their faces lit with mirth at a spectacle they would recall later as scandalous entertainment. The music faltered, the quartet uncertain whether to play on, their bows trembling against strings. The air itself felt heavy, thick with shame, though not the bride's, not the bridesmaids', not the groomsmen's. It rested instead on the shoulders of the woman who bent to the floor, her silence a shield that no laughter could pierce. The groom sat rigid beside his bride, his jaw tight, his hand frozen on the tablecloth. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched her, the woman who had been mocked all night, now ordered to crawl beneath the eyes of the entire hall. Something inside him snapped. He could not unsee the contrast. His bride dazzling in jewels and cruelty. The waitress, plain in her uniform, shining with strength even as she knelt. The noise of the hall faded in his ears, replaced by the steady rhythm of his own breath. His chair scraped back against the marble, a sound sharper than any laugh, cutting through the chatter. He rose, tall and unshaking, his voice slicing into the air with finality. Enough. The hall froze in the moment after his voice cut through the air. The bride's laughter died on her lips. The bridesmaids turned in disbelief, and the groomsmen shifted uncomfortably in their seats. All around, the guests leaned forward, wide-eyed, wine glasses hovering half-raised. The groom stood tall, no trace of hesitation in his eyes as he looked down at the woman he had just married. His words came steady and strong, echoing over the hush. "I will not spend my life tied to cruelty. Not tonight, not ever." The statement rippled through the room like a stone cast into still water. Gasps erupted, some sharp with outrage, others stunned into silence. The bride's face flushed red, her painted lips parting in disbelief. Her hand gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white as though she could anchor herself to the moment by sheer force. But the groom did not falter. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the hall, addressing not just his bride, but every guest gathered to celebrate. He spoke of dignity, of humanity, of the grace he had seen in the waitress, who now knelt on the marble floor. He said she had shown more strength and kindness in her silence than all the laughter that had poisoned the night. His voice carried across the tables, steady as if he had rehearsed it all his life, though he had only just now found the words. "This is not the marriage I want," he declared. "Not the life I will build. A marriage without compassion is not a marriage at all." The hall erupted again, whispers flying in every direction. Some shook their heads, scandal flashing in their eyes. Others sat back, lips pressed tight, unwilling to admit the truth they had seen but unwilling to deny it either. The bride stammered, her voice rising in disbelief, but the groom did not give her the chance to turn the moment back into her own. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his hand. The gold band gleamed under the chandelier light, a symbol that had already lost its meaning. With a movement as final as a closing door, he slid the ring from his finger and placed it on the white tablecloth. The sound of metal against porcelain echoed louder than any laugh that had filled the room before. Every eye followed him as he stepped away from the head table. His shoes struck the marble with firm certainty, each step breaking the silence further. The bride's voice rose behind him, shrill with anger, but he did not turn. He walked to where the waitress still knelt, cloth in hand, her face lifted now in stunned disbelief. For a moment, the hall seemed to hold its breath. The music stilled, the guests leaning forward as if to catch every detail. He reached her side, crouched down so his voice would not tower over her, and extended his hand. The gesture was simple, but in it lay the weight of everything he had said, everything he had just abandoned. She looked at him, her eyes wide, her hands trembling slightly as though uncertain whether the moment could possibly be real. But his gaze did not waver, filled with quiet certainty. His hand remained open, patient, waiting. The hall gasped again, louder than before. The bride screamed, the bridesmaids covered their mouths, the groomsmen shifted with unease, but none of it could stop the moment from unfolding. He had chosen, and in his choice, the world of the ballroom had shifted forever. The bride's scream tore through the hall, shrill and furious, echoing against marble and crystal. Her voice broke into the shocked silence, but it did nothing to stop what had already begun. The bridesmaids stood frozen, their smiles vanished, their laughter stilled. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Others glanced toward the guests, as if searching for reassurance that this could not possibly be happening. Whispers spread like wildfire, moving from table to table, rising into a chorus of disbelief and astonishment. Faces turned, eyes followed every movement as the groom remained steady, his hand still offered to the waitress. She hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her hand in his. It was small, trembling, but the strength in her grip was undeniable. He helped her to her feet, and though her heart raced with the weight of so many eyes upon her, she lifted her chin. The laughter that once mocked her was gone. In its place was awe, shock, and the slow dawning recognition that dignity could not be silenced. Her back was straight, her steps measured, and even in her plain uniform, she stood taller than those in gowns and jewels. The groom turned once to face the room, his expression calm yet resolute. He spoke no further words, for none were needed. The ring he had left on the table told the story. The choice he had made echoed louder than any speech. He stepped forward, guiding her beside him, and together they began their walk toward the doors. Guests shifted as they passed, some leaning back as if afraid to be touched by the gravity of the moment, others leaning forward to glimpse the unlikely pair who had turned an entire wedding into a stage for truth. The bride shrieked behind them, her voice cracking with rage. She demanded he return, she cursed him, she cried betrayal, but her fury only deepened the silence that fell over the hall. No one moved to comfort her. No one dared to follow him. The bridesmaids stood pale and uncertain, the groomsmen silent in their seats. The groom walked on, steady, with the waitress by his side. Each step seemed to strip away the false glamour of the evening, leaving behind only the simple brilliance of courage and grace. When the great doors opened, the cool night air swept inside, carrying with it a sense of release. The chandeliers still glittered behind them, but their light seemed dull compared to the radiance of the moment unfolding. The waitress walked tall, her head high, and though her heart thundered in disbelief, her presence shone brighter than the jewels left clattering in the ballroom. She was no longer invisible, no longer the subject of sneers. She was a figure of dignity, admired by those who had moments earlier dismissed her. That night became legend. Guests would speak of it in hushed tones for years to come, repeating how a bride's cruelty had been exposed, how arrogance had been broken by the quiet strength of a woman who refused to bend. The story would pass beyond the walls of the ballroom, retold as proof that wealth and beauty mean nothing without kindness, that grace can shatter cruelty in a single instant. And as the groom and the waitress walked into the night, hand in hand, the truth was clear to everyone who had witnessed it. The chandeliers had sparkled,